Well, good evening, everyone. Nice to see so many people out this evening. You know, it's not for the first time in the long history of Europe that storm clouds are seen gathering over that continent. Prophets of doom and of gloom can't expect to be popular. And tonight it's my task to tell you some of the sober truth about what is to come to pass on that continent. It's my task to tell you about the approaching darkness which is soon to spread across Europe. It's not my message, it's the message to all of us from the Bible. And so it is that those storm clouds are seen descending. If you watch the news day by day, you'll see this happening. And for many years now, the world has been concerned about the Russian bear. When the Soviet Union, the USSR, chained half of Europe following World War II, Winston Churchill described that takeover as an iron curtain descending upon Europe. In the early 1990s, it appeared that those Iron Curtain countries had gained their freedom back again. Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, the Ukraine, and so on. But now we have to ask, was that a cosmetic and temporary freedom that appeared at that time? Now, the Bible gives us a clear answer. And that answer is in one of the chapters that we read together tonight, Ezekiel chapter 38. The message that we have, brethren and sisters and friends, is one of approaching judgment upon a world that is saturated with rebellion against God and increasing wickedness. We don't like to say these things, and we don't hold ourselves up to be self-righteous in any shape or form. But it's the truth. It's also a message, however, of hope, of redemption, of salvation to those who turn to God in faith. So what I have to say to you tonight is that we face a time for faith, not a time for fear. And when we look at that passage from Ezekiel chapter 38, looking at it from the American Standard Version, we read the words there that the word of Jehovah, or Yahweh, came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I want to draw your attention, friends, to that phrase, the land of Magog. It's in your authorized version the same. And also to the name Rosh. Where exactly is this? The Jewish historian Josephus, writing at about the time of Christ, or just shortly afterwards, says that Magog, who is mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, founded the Magogites, and are by the Greeks called Scythians. So that gives us an idea who it is. It's what the historians or the Greeks called Scythia. So we ask the question, where is Scythia? Well, the historian Herodotus lived about BC 446, not very long after Ezekiel himself, in fact. And he describes what he understood to be the area of Scythia in Europe. And it was an area that ran between the river Danube and the river Don in Russia. And it's shown on the map there before you now. But look where that is today. Look at that area now. Here it is. Magog today involves Germany, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Slovakia, Moldova, Romania, and the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Now, this fits exactly the countries which were part of the Soviet Empire behind the Iron Curtain prior to the 1990. These countries, says Ezekiel, are to be ruled by a chief called Gog. Well, who's he? When we look at the meaning of the word, the meaning of the name in Gesenius's lexicon, this is what we learn. First, obviously, it's a proper name. Of the prince of the land of Magog, Ezekiel 38. Also of the Roshi, the Moskai, the Tabarini, who is to come with great forces from the extreme north, Ezekiel 38, verse 15. After the exile, that means to say after the Jews have been brought back to their land to some degree, and he's coming to invade the Holy Land and to perish there. The name means, according to the Companion Bible, it means all that is powerful, gigantic, and proud. And it goes on there to give some more ideas of that. We see that the basic name means high or warlike, according to some of the people that understand these latter-day things. And in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 8, which we have read together, we see there in verse 8 of that chapter that this has to come about in the latter days. And in verse 16 of the chapter, the same chapter, we read that it is in the latter days, in the latter years, in the latter days. So we must look then for, and this is important for us to grasp this, we are to look for a group of nations to be prepared and assembled, verse 7 of Ezekiel 38, and guarded or protected by this Gog character. After World War II, this Iron Curtain descended upon Europe and divided it. It was a divided continent, and many of us older ones who are now getting a little old and decrepit, we remember well the situation when the map looked like that. It was a divided Europe. You just didn't go for a holiday trip to Poland in those days. You can now, but in those days you didn't. Well, that was the situation. Well, it was the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, that brought about what they called a re-evaluation of the social question. That was in 1961. And consequently, they called for, I quote, a rebuilding of the social order. That was the message in this encyclical that was put out at that particular time. It's called New Light on Social Problems, 1961 it was, and that is what really brought about a real change in the social conditions in Europe at that particular time. But it was a change the Vatican wanted, and it was a change that couldn't just come about immediately. It wasn't going to be an overnight matter. And so we look at the next encyclical that came out in 1963. It was called Pacem in Terris, and it's the English title is Peace on Earth. So by bringing together the two sides, as we have just indicated, and the rebuilding of a new social system between what was then known as communism and then what became known later on as capitalism, and bringing the two together because they were really divided back in those days. And so the call for a multicultural society came out of this. He called it the formation of a world community. So you wouldn't have a divided state anymore. There wouldn't be the communists over there and the capitalists over there. But notice the wording of John the 23rd in 1963 in this particular encyclical. Under the subheading, Little by Little, he wrote this: all things must be of gradual growth. The work must be done slowly and deliberately from within. And that is exactly how the Vatican went about it. That is exactly, and that's not my words, those are the words coming straight out of this encyclical. The work must be done slowly and deliberately from within. So communism, capitalism, and Catholicism could now form the basis of a new world community. Again, I speak to those of senior years like myself, and you will know that a great social change came over the world during those years. Since 1963, most people wouldn't even notice it as it happened because it was done slowly and gradually, but it was done. And suddenly, instead of working in hospital as I did, and was referred to as Mr. Billington, I was now Paul. And all these kind of changes came about. And you can see them in education, you can see them in cultural matters. It changed the whole way. Well, this went on, and eventually we found that the two sides were brought together. Whoever would have thought that the leader of Russia, the Soviet Union, would be in dialogue with the Pope? But that is what happened. It might not sound so strange for people today to realise that, but when I was growing up, it was, well, a story like Alice in Wonderland, really, I suppose you could say. You know? So that is what happened, and so things were coming together. Until we come to 1991, and headlines like this in the newspaper appeared. The communists opened the Berlin Wall. The division was brought to an end. The Independent newspaper of the UK, August 1991, that was, communist rule began in 1917, Gorbachev ended it yesterday. These were tremendous changes that were taking place. Tremendous changes that at the time they'd made news headlines, but people soon forget and get on with life, and that's the way it was. And so it was a cosmetic change as part of the building of a new order, of a new cultural order. And so what we see when we look at Ezekiel chapter 38 is that this Gog and all those people that were assembled with him, they were going to be turned back. That's what Ezekiel says. Ezekiel 38 and verse 4, God says through the prophet, he says, I will turn you back and put hooks into your jaws and will bring you forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, and all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Or armaments for war, in other words. Verse 5, Persia, that's Iran, Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters. So you can see, can't you, that this includes far more than those old USSR empire that we referred to a moment ago. And so what happened was, sorry, that was the passage I should have had on the screen. Wall Street Journal, this was. Moscow reasserts itself in the former Soviet Empire. That, friends, wasn't this week, it wasn't last week, that was 6 years ago. And it's talking about the time when Russia moved into Georgia. And there it was. Many of you will remember that event when they moved into Georgia, reasserting themselves in the old Soviet Empire. That's the way they put it. And we saw it with Maclean's magazine here in Canada, and The Economist, Russia Resurgent, and so the things went on. That's 6 years ago. Cartoons came out, such as this one. Cartoon in The Economist depicts Vladimir Putin erecting a new authoritarian Russia, a platform for the autocrat of all Russia and Europe. And this was the situation as we saw it develop. But looking at the scripture, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah. So before going on to fulfill the rest of the prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 38, which brings them against the land of Israel and against the mountains of Israel, before going on to do that, you have to have this association, this confederacy of nations working together before they go on to fulfill the rest of the prophecy. Russia must form this confederacy. And when you look at the map and you look at what Ezekiel chapter 38 is telling us, you see all the various nations, and you realize that if that prophecy is to be fulfilled, these nations must be brought together. This is where events are heading now. As we watch the news, we can see this taking shape. Just looking at some news headlines. This was the BBC. US warning to Russia over Georgia 6 years ago. That's 2008. The Jerusalem Post. The bear claw on the trigger. The Jerusalem Post had quite a bit to say about all this, and I'm going to read it to you, although it's a little bit lengthy perhaps. After coming to the rescue of Russian civilians, or citizens rather, in South Ossetia, Moscow may demand the repatriation of its people from Ukraine. Interesting. 6 years ago. Along with their land. In respect to Israel too, Russian leaders often proclaim a special relationship based on hundreds of thousands of Russian people who reside here. This may still be over the horizon, but you read it here first. Someday, a representative delegation of these Russians may invoke the Ossetian precedent to appeal for protection from Moscow. With a large part of the Russian fleet moved by then from Sevastopol, Crimea, to Tartus, Syria, such an intervention may be at least as feasible as was 1967. You get the idea where these things can lead. The BBC again. Western words fall on deaf Russian ears. Well, they did. And now we have the Crimean crisis. The Crimea Peninsula is just there, just north in the Black Sea, and it occupies a very strategic position. And so events over the last few weeks, friends, have brought us to a crisis stage. And England's Daily Mirror had this headline: Putin threat to the UK's gas, a new Cold War. US warns Russia as crisis deepens in the Ukraine. That's where we are now. That was March the 3rd, 2014. We're up to date now, aren't we? March the 5th, the Daily Telegraph. Ukraine crisis. Sanctions won't worry Vladimir Putin. The National Catholic Reporter, that's a Canadian paper. Crisis in Ukraine, replay of what led up to the World War II, says the priest. You know, this is where we're going. This is serious business. It's what we are facing in the world today. And the Express from the UK. Russian military move on the Ukraine would echo Hitler annexing the Sudetenland, expert warns. Beginning to look a bit familiar, isn't it? March the 7th. Putin mocks the West and threatens to turn off the gas. They hold the cards, don't they? That's where we are. The Christian Post, March the 8th. Ukraine priests in front lines, ministering to people amid violence. I read you a little quotation from the Catholic encyclical, which said how they wanted to build a new world community. They are involved in these things, very much so. Not always in the headlines, if you don't look in the right place, but nonetheless, there you are. And so the priests were there in the front lines, ministering to the peoples in the violence. And there they are. And nowadays, you see the Roman Catholic Church joining together, joining arms with the Orthodox Church, whether that Orthodox Church is based in Moscow or whether it's based in Istanbul or wherever it might be. But there it is. So they're all working to one and the same end. March the 12th. Belarus, that's one of the neighbours of Russia. Belarus says Russia to send warplanes in response to NATO drills. So NATO is beginning to get a little nervous now. And so they start to bolster their forces a little bit. And so Russia responds and by sending warplanes into the area. The Associated Press, March the 14th. After Crimea, wary Eastern Europe asks, who's next? We've seen Georgia go. We've seen Crimea. Who then is next? It's not me asking these questions. I want to emphasise that. This is newspaper headlines that I collect, and there's a lot more I could give you. I'm already taking too much time reading them out to you. But there it is. After Crimea, wary Eastern Europe asks, who is next? After Crimea, world anxious about next Putin move. I'll say. NATO chief. Russian aggression is wake-up call. Yeah, they've been asleep, haven't they? Putin's Crimea takeover sends shivers across ex-Soviet Union. You know, friends, for us in Canada, this is all a long way away. You go and talk to people who live in Germany. You go and talk to people even in the UK. And it's much closer to home. It's much more serious for them than what we think it is for us. But don't let's be fooled. Don't let's be fooled. And so the same people are behind the scenes. The Pope calls for dialogue in Ukraine to resolve its crisis. Well, that sounds very nice, until you realise what the history is that all along they've been planning. All along they've been working this out so that it would come that way. So the Vatican is still involved. the objective has not changed. A world community which will have certain characteristics. Well, people begin to wake up. Germany accuses Russia of trying to break apart Europe. Well, don't have to try very hard these days. And what do we mean by Europe? Do we just mean those countries that were once part of the USSR empire, shall we say? Ezekiel 38 tells us no. It's all about a country called Gomer. And you see on the map there where I've placed Gomer. And that is because it's what I read in the various sources that we can get. For example, Young's Concordance. Gomer, he was progenitor of the Cimmerians, the Cimbri and other branches of the Celtic family, as well as of the modern Gael and Cymru. Oh, if you brought up where I came from, that's Cymraeg, that's Wales. They settled on the north of the Black Sea and then spread themselves southward and westward to the extremities of Europe. They weren't going to just stay there. They went to the westward to the extremities of Europe. The Encyclopaedia Britannica. The Celts continually moved westward. The Belgi, that's the Belgiques, who were Cimbric in origin, had spread across the Rhine and given their name to all northern France and Belgium. So you see where this is going. It's going to involve all Europe. Now, we've been talking about Ezekiel chapter 38, but there is another prophecy found in Daniel chapter 2, which is in a way parallel to the one of Ezekiel. It also tells us of a latter-day assemblage of nations that are going to exist. Daniel chapter 2. Many of you will be familiar with this image prophecy. The head of gold is Babylon, and after it would arise another kingdom inferior, and another third kingdom, and so on. It goes through the various parts of that image as it is described. Using the symbol of the image or idol, it describes various kingdoms or empires that would succeed in following after Babylon. Taken together, the image of the kingdom of men, or the kingdoms of men, constitute a latter-day Babylon, because that's what it was all based on. And in the Apocalypse, that's the book of Revelation, you will read there of Babylon the Great. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 28, I'm going to just read this straight to you from the scriptures. There is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known, in this case to Nebuchadnezzar, but now to us as well, what shall be in the latter days. The dream and the visions of thy head were upon thy head, and he goes on to describe the vision in some detail. And so we have this vision of the image in chapter 2 of Daniel. And it represents all these empires being brought together. Yes, the kingdom of men was divided. It was divided between east and west. Yet it was to be broken in pieces together. That's what we see in the prophecy. Broken in pieces together. And there it is in verse 35 of Daniel chapter 2. So the various parts, or the kingdoms, must be welded together, as it were, and stand complete before being broken in pieces together. So bring all the parts together before the image is broken. The last form of the image of Babylon will include both east and west. It will include the Greek brass in the east, and it will include the Roman iron in the west, as in the days of the Roman Empire under Justinian, which had a similar pattern to it, to that. So looking at this prophecy in 1854, It's now 2014, so I'll let you do the maths. Looking at this prophecy in 1854, and at the time of the Crimean War, a medical doctor and student of the Bible saw that the parts must be confederated. They must be brought together. It was in a book that he entitled, intriguingly enough, Russia Triumphant and Europe Chained. And speaking of the leaders of Europe, he says their leaders are all wrong in supposing that the age of conquest is past forever, and that they will succeed in establishing the freedom and independence of Europe. There never has been such an age of conquest as that which will soon open upon the world. And as to the establishment of European freedom and independence, the war to be initiated is the setting in of an overwhelming inundation that will submerge them under one of the most terrible and scorching despotisms that ever wrung the heart of nations. 1854, that was being written. Another writer, known to many in our audience tonight, was Robert Roberts. And this is what he wrote in 1862 in a book entitled Christendom Astray. He said, "The supremacy of Russia is foretold. She is to vanquish many countries and hold a protectorate over them, as indicated by the words, 'Be thou a guard unto them.' Those countries include all the nations of the continent, Gomer and his bands. The house of Togama of the North Quarters will be found on reference to ancient geography to embrace nearly every country in Europe. And in addition to these, there are Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, showing that at the time, Russia will have attained to something like universal dominion." This, friends, is where things are going. And so it's no wonder that the Germans are getting worried, as are a number of other people. This was Der Spiegel, the German magazine, and the headline was, "Who will stop Putin? Who will stop Putin?" Look again at the trend of events. And do you notice the leaders of Europe all looking up to Putin? And do you notice that Angela Merkel is holding a white flag? Do you know what a white flag means? Look again at the trend of events and see where things are going. Reuters, March the 31st, so we're getting pretty close to where we are now. NATO plans more support for East Europeans. NATO plans more support for the East Europeans is worried by the Crimea. So there is a pushback beginning. That's an important point to notice. April the 1st. As Russia growls, Swedes, Finns eye defence options. NATO. Where is all this going? Do you see a clash developing between NATO, which we thought was fast asleep, and Russia, who obviously hasn't been fast asleep? And behind it all, you've got the Vatican at work. April the 1st. NATO to bolster forces in Eastern Europe. They see no Russian pullback. Russia, Putin had said he would pull back forces. There's been no real sign of it so far. The Daily Telegraph, April the 1st, 2014. Ukraine crisis. Poland asks NATO to station 10,000 troops on its territory. I want you to ask yourself, where are those troops going to come from? Young people Have you ever thought that in our day and our age there could be another call for military service? Certainly in Britain, certainly in the United States, the draft they call it there, conscription they call it in England, same thing. Think about it. Are you ready to make a stand before the authorities against military service using force? Isn't it time we were looking at this question again? Isn't it? There are a lot of people in our community who have got a lot to offer on this subject, and we ought to be able to be willing to hear them. Where are the troops to come from? Are we ready for this? Ukraine crisis. It's just a few days ago, a day or two ago. NATO to step up military cooperation with Russia's neighbours, that is to say, with people like Poland and Hungary and so on and so forth. And so what you see, or what the media sees at any rate, is they see a push by NATO going towards Russia. You see, you sometimes have to look at these things from the other guy's point of view. We always think of the Russian bear coming down and, wow, you know, that's where the aggression's coming from. Look at it from Russia's point of view. For Russia's point of view, they see NATO gradually getting closer and closer and closer to their home territory. And it reminded me of a passage which I don't think is directly involved just yet, but could be before very long, and it's in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40, where it says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And we haven't identified the king of the south tonight, but there it is. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north, and I think you can begin to guess who that is, shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall pass over, shall overflow and pass over. So a sudden inundation from this power of the north, responding to the pushback that we see happening now. And this, of course, could well happen when Russia wakes up to it, which she is doing, and we may very well see the headline that was put on that booklet back in 1854, we may see it almost in our newspapers. Russia triumphant and Europe chained. A Russian Latino-Greek confederacy. In other words, Russia, the Latins and the Greeks, all sides of Europe are involved here. Now that was the conclusion of John Thomas studying the book of Daniel, or his prophecy, way back then. Now today, as you look at events, if you take a map and you can circle these two spheres of influence as they are being contested by the powers that be. There is the Ukraine, which I'm sure we all are aware of now, but tucked in just behind Ukraine there are some other little countries like Moldova and so on. And the other area we dealt with 6 years ago, which was Georgia. And you see other countries as well that are in that same area, and they are being mentioned by the media on almost a daily basis now. So the question that's being asked is, who is next after the Crimea? Now, this was a newspaper display. Look at the countries: Kazakhstan, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia. And when you look at the others that are mentioned there, like the Crimea, South Ossetia, and so on and so forth, we are seeing these countries beginning to shake in their shoes because they can see what happened to Georgia, what happened to Crimea, could happen to them. So, world leaders are engaged in a deadly game. And the prize is Europe. All Europe. And don't think because we're tucked away here in North America it won't affect us. It will affect us. Like it affected us in the Second World War. Like it affected us in the First World War. If there is wisdom, we will prepare ourselves for that. We will prepare our young people for that. We will be holding some important classes on the subject. Look at what's happening. Here are the moves that we can see. The black ones we can see. Number one, they're already in place, moving into the borders of Poland, Belarus, moving into Crimea, moving into Georgia. And what about Iran? And what about Syria? Do you notice a pattern that's forming there? And then the red ones, the red arrows, are probable future moves as the soft underbelly of Europe is targeted before the final triumph. It's all happening. It's all there. And we need to be thankful that these things have been pointed out to us in the scriptures of truth. Not surprising then that Russia says we are ready for a new Cold War. And not only that, the Daily Telegraph paper there says Russia nuclear strike threat. Did you read the news item the other day where the Russian media man said quite blatantly that they could turn the United States into ashes? These are not the words of a peaceful world. These are the words of a world that is getting more and more hostile. And just to make the point, the Prime Minister of Russia, I can never pronounce his name properly, Medvedev or something or other, right? But he goes and visits Crimea. That was just yesterday, I think it was. Talk about poking somebody in the eye. That's what he's done. How soon Russia will go forward from this position, friends, I don't know. It may be a while. Perhaps another 6 years will go by before they make another move. Perhaps it won't. But as I was saying here a few weeks ago, you know, it's 6 years since we saw those events in Georgia and the news headlines that went with it. What have we done with the time since then to prepare ourselves? What have we done with the time? Have we really turned ourselves more wholeheartedly to our God? There isn't much time left. We've got to work at this, and I want to stress how that we need to help one another in all this. I don't know how soon it may be before Russia makes its grand move, but that's what John Thomas wrote in 1849. And our presiding brother tonight, he read it out for us, but I'm going to read it for you again. 1849. in the book Elpis Israel, it's in the preface, he wrote, "The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times." Boy, are they ever. "Because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. The Russian autocracy in its plenitude and on the verge of dissolution is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing on the mountains of Israel." We've talked about that. "Ready to be smitten by the stone. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand." You know, friends, I have to say this. Since a boy, I've been brought up in a movement known as the Christadelphians. I was baptized into the Christadelphian system when I was 18, I think it was. It's a long name, I'm getting old. Yeah. Am I glad that I was brought up with the knowledge that I've got? Am I glad? Because now when I see these things, I can see clearly that what I have believed all these years is true, and it's coming to pass before my eyes. And as that quotation goes on to say, "The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact, and salvation will be to those who not only looked for it, but have trimmed their lamps by believing the gospel of the kingdom unto the obedience of faith, and the perfection thereof in fruits meet for repentance." And that's what I'm working on. Fruits meet for repentance. I need to develop those. And I'm sure there's many of you in the audience who will feel the same way. And so, as we look at the prophecy, we've just dealt with a little bit of it tonight that deals more, we've concentrated and focused more upon Europe. But the time will come when Russia will move forward, and eventually she will meet her doom on the mountains of Israel. That is what Ezekiel tells us. You read the chapter when you go home and go through it carefully. The image of Babylon is to be broken in pieces by the stone power of Christ and his saints working through Israel. That is what the future holds. So, today, now, is a time for faith. It's not a time for fear. These things might be frightening. It's not a time for fear, it's a time for faith. And that faith comes by hearing. And it comes from hearing the word of God. And hearing means to hear it and understand. We have to gain an understanding of the word of God, of the scriptures, of the Bible. And so it was that Jesus said in Luke chapter 21, "There will be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon earth distress of nations with perplexity," can't find a way out, "the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven," that's the political heaven, "will be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in clouds with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh." And that's where we are today. So we have to get ourselves in hand. If we're not baptized and if we haven't come to the knowledge of the truth yet, then we've got to do some studying. We've got to get ourselves in order. And so it is that our redemption draws near. as does the redemption of all Israel. Thank you for being with me tonight. Thank you for listening. And welcome to all those who are overseas and elsewhere. It's been lovely to have you with us tonight. And so I urge you to look carefully into these things and prepare, because we are living in momentous times. Thank you very much.